Before the world divided Africa with borders drawn in distant European capitals, before its sons and daughters were torn from its shores in the agony of chains, and before the names of empires faded into obscurity, Africa was a land of limitless power, innovation and wealth, a continent that rivaled any empire in history. But beneath its thriving cities and unstoppable empires, a storm was brewing. Picture this, the year is 1591. The Songhai Empire dominates West Africa, stretching its influence across the Sahara. Gao, its capital, is alive, merchants trading gold for salt, scholars debating science and philosophy in Timbuktu's ancient halls. To the outside world, this was a land of mastery, not mystery. But what no one knew was that Songhai stood on the edge of disaster, because at the same time, to the west, something far more alarming unfolds. Along the Atlantic coast, Portuguese ships drop anchor in the harbors of the Kingdom of Congo. What begins as trade, textiles, spices, quickly descends into something darker, the trafficking of human lives. Men, women, children, entire communities, are torn from their homes. Chained, beaten, and sold to faraway lands, their cries swallowed by the vast ocean, they are now destined for plantations thousands of miles away. Fast forward to the 19th century. Africa, now a continent under siege, faces a new kind of invasion. At the Berlin Conference of 1884, in distant Europe, men who have never set foot on African soil map its future and divide Africa with a ruler and with the stroke of a pen. What they didn't account for were the people who lived there: the Kingdom of Benin, renowned for its bronzes, the Zulu nation under Shaka, a military genius whose reforms transformed his warriors into legends, and the Herero people of Namibia, who rise against German oppressors in a defiance that echoes far into history. This is the story of Africa. A story of kingdoms and conquests, of resilience and rebellion, of ancient knowledge and modern struggles, and in this video, we'll uncover how Africa transformed over 4 centuries, how it weathered invasions, slavery, and colonization, yet forged pathways to independence and cultural revival. This is not just history, it is the heartbeat of a continent that refuses to be forgotten. Imagine standing on the banks of the Niger River in the 16th century. The golden sun reflects off the bustling markets of Gao, where merchants from across the Sahara exchange gold, salt, and slaves. The empire that dominates this vast region is the Songhai Empire, the largest and wealthiest empire West Africa had ever seen. At its center, Askia Muhammad I, a ruler with one goal: to turn Songhai into a fortress of power and prosperity. Under his command, trade routes flourished, tax systems grew airtight, and armies, tens of thousands strong, guarded every corner of the empire. But Songhai was not just about wealth. In Timbuktu, knowledge was king. The Sankore University, buzzing with scholars from across the world, safeguarded centuries-old manuscripts on medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. Timbuktu became a lighthouse of learning, while Europe was still grappling with its Renaissance. Yet beneath this brilliance, cracks were forming. Songhai's riches attracted eyes from afar. Greed bred enemies. And somewhere in the distance, a storm was gathering. 1591, across the Sahara, the Sultan of Morocco, Ahmad al-Mansur, sees Songhai's gold as his for the taking. He has something the Songhai do not: gunpowder. Moroccan soldiers wield arquebus, crude but deadly firearms. The invasion begins. Thousands of Moroccan troops cross the Sahara, the heat unbearable, the desert unforgiving. Yet they march on, driven by greed. At Tondabai, the Songhai army, mighty and vast, armed with swords and spears, prepares to defend its empire. But the battle is over before it begins. Songhai's warriors charge, only to be met by a sound they'd never heard before: gunfire. The air cracks with explosions. Bullets tear through shields, armor, and flesh. In mere hours, Songhai's forces are broken. Its empire begins to crumble. Thousands fell in a matter of hours. It wasn't just the fall of an empire, it was the collapse of a world order that had lasted for centuries. The Songhai Empire disintegrated, leaving behind ruins where thriving cities once stood. While Songhai fell in the west, in Central Africa, the Kingdom of Congo stood strong. Its capital, Banza-Congo, was a city of order and might, governed with precision. Provinces were well organized, taxes flowed, and armies kept the kingdom secure. But everything changed with the arrival of the Portuguese. At first, it was trade, textiles, tools, spices. Then, it was people. The Portuguese wanted slaves, and they were relentless. King Afonso I, a devout Christian, tried to fight back. He pleaded with the Portuguese king in letters that still exist today. "Our kingdom is being emptied, our people are being stolen, even the nobles." But his words fell on deaf ears. The slave trade was too profitable to stop. Congo fractured from within, rival factions turned on each other, selling captives to the Portuguese for guns and gold. What had once been a powerful kingdom spiraled into chaos. Congo's leaders fought to save their people, but they were trapped. Trapped in a system that tore their kingdom apart, piece by piece. Meanwhile, in East Africa, the Ethiopian Empire fought to hold its ground. This was no new kingdom. Ethiopia was ancient, its rulers tracing their bloodline to King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Christianity was their foundation, and the Ethiopian highlands were their shield. But in the 16th century, a new threat emerged, the Adal Sultanate, led by Ahmed ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi. Ahmed, known as the Conqueror, was ruthless. With Ottoman guns and a fierce army, he launched an invasion that shattered Ethiopia's defenses. Towns burned. Centuries-old churches, symbols of Ethiopia's soul, were reduced to rubble. Ahmed's forces swept through the highlands like a storm, leaving devastation in their wake. Ethiopia was on the edge of annihilation. Desperate, Emperor Galaudas turned to Europe. The Portuguese, eager to gain influence, sent troops armed with muskets. Together, Ethiopian warriors and Portuguese soldiers met Ahmed's forces at the Battle of Wainadaga. The battle was brutal. Muskets roared, swords clashed, and the earth trembled. But Ethiopia held the line. Ahmed fell in battle, and his forces crumbled. The Adal Sultanate was defeated, but Ethiopia was left scarred, its lands ravaged, its people forever changed. By the end of the 16th century, Africa was at a breaking point. The Songhai Empire had fallen to Moroccan cannons. The Kingdom of Congo was drowning under the weight of the slave trade. Ethiopia had barely survived a war that almost wiped it from the map. Across the continent, European powers had taken their first steps into Africa, using trade, religion, and war to exploit its riches. The balance of power was shifting. Empires that had stood tall for centuries were crumbling, and new pressures, internal and external, were building. Yet, amidst all this chaos, Africa's story was far from over. From the ashes of these empires would rise new leaders, new kingdoms, and a resistance that would change the course of history. But in the 17th century, the storm would only grow stronger. But before this, there is a question we need to revisit: what was really like to live in this period, and what was the impact of the transatlantic slave trade on the world at large? It all started as exploration. In the late 1400s, Portuguese ships appeared along Africa's western coast, their sails catching the wind and their captains driven by gold and curiosity. Led by men like Prince Henry the Navigator, they sought Africa's wealth, gold from Mali, ivory from Central Africa, and spices to rival the riches of India. But as they sailed further south, stopping at places like the Kingdom of Congo, they discovered something that would fuel the economy for the next 400 years: human labor. At first, it was small. African captives were sent to Portuguese plantations on the islands of Madeira and Cape Verde to work the fields. Then the Americas changed everything. With endless land and booming sugar plantations, European colonizers needed workers, thousands of them. West Africa became their solution. Then the trade became something far darker. Entire villages were raided, families torn apart, and communities shattered. What began as a handful of captives spiraled into a systematic human economy, and millions would be swallowed by it. And Africa's coastlines became gateways to hell. By the 16th century, Portugal, Spain, and soon Britain, France, and the Dutch had turned the continent's western shores into vast prisons. Captured Africans were marched for hundreds of miles, chained together, branded like cattle, and held in dungeons such as Elmina Castle in Ghana. Their fate? The ships. For every 10 Africans loaded onto a ship, at least 2 would die before reaching land. Yet despite the horror, the trade continued. Over 12 million Africans were taken from their homes. Some historians estimate another 2 million never made it off the ships alive. This was the Middle Passage, a name that barely scratches the horror of what happened below deck. Enslaved Africans were crammed into wooden holds where there was no room to stand or breathe. Chained to planks, they lay in their own waste. Disease spread like wildfire. Survivors later spoke of suffocating air, the cries of the dying, and the constant fear that they would be next. For every 10 Africans forced onto a ship, at least 2 would die before ever reaching land. Over 12 million Africans were stolen from their homes. Historians believe another 2 million perished at sea. This was no accident of history. It was a machine, efficient, relentless, and devastating. The Americas' booming economies, including Brazil, the Caribbean, and the United States, were built on human lives, and Africa paid the price. This slave trade tore into Africa like a blade. The loss of millions, primarily young men and women, decimated the population, entire regions were gutted, societies disintegrated, and kingdoms collapsed under the pressure. Imagine the Kingdom of Congo, once a thriving state. With Portuguese merchants demanding slaves, its rulers turned on their neighbors, capturing captives for European guns and goods. Entire villages were destroyed. Families were shattered forever. But it wasn't just external powers. African kingdoms like the Ashanti and Dahomey in West Africa grew wealthy by participating in the trade. They raided villages, kidnapped captives, and traded people for muskets and cloth. Yet this short-term power came with a cost. The very economies they built became dependent on slavery. Local industries died, farming declined, and violence became the new currency. Africa wasn't just losing people, it was losing its foundation. Yet, even in the face of devastation, there was resistance. In the 17th century, one name struck fear into the hearts of Portuguese slave traders: Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba, in modern-day Angola. A warrior, diplomat, and ruler, Nzinga refused to let her people be enslaved. In 1624, as Portuguese forces invaded her territory, Nzinga stood tall in negotiations. When the Portuguese governor refused her a chair, she ordered a servant to kneel so she could sit on his back, declaring, "I will never bow to you." Nzinga's resistance was relentless. She formed alliances with the Dutch, led her warriors into battle, and used guerrilla tactics to disrupt slave raids. For decades, she held off the Portuguese, proving that Africans were not passive victims. They fought. They resisted. They endured. The transatlantic slave trade was not just a tragedy, it was a turning point that changed Africa, Europe, and the Americas forever. Yet, even in this devastation, Africa's spirit survived. Languages, music, and traditions traveled with the enslaved across the Atlantic. In places like the Caribbean and Brazil, African rhythms mixed with new influences to create new forms of art, music, religion, and culture that would reshape the Americas. But in the 17th century, the storm would only grow stronger. In the winter of 1884, a group of European leaders gathered in Berlin, Germany. There were no African leaders, no representatives, no voices from the continent they were about to divide. Inside grand halls, under crystal chandeliers, 14 European powers sat around enormous maps of Africa. Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, the most powerful nations of the time, didn't come to negotiate, they came to divide. With rulers and pens, rivers became borders, mountains became barriers, and entire communities were erased with a single stroke. It wasn't about understanding Africa, it was about control. To them, Africa wasn't home to ancient kingdoms and rich cultures, it was land, resources, and opportunity. Territories like the Zulu Kingdom and the House Estates were reduced to colored lines on a map. In just 3 months, Europe carved up an entire continent without firing a shot. It wasn't conquest on a battlefield, it was theft in a boardroom. The consequences of those lines would echo for generations. Once the lines were drawn, the race to claim Africa began. France took the largest share, sweeping across West Africa and North Africa. Their approach was direct rule. African leaders were replaced with French administrators. Cities like Dakar and Algiers became a miniature version of Europe, where African cultures were replaced with European systems. Local languages were suppressed, replaced by French education and laws. For the French, the colonies were an extension of their empire, not separate nations. The British, however, used indirect rule. They allowed local African leaders, chiefs and kings, to remain in power, but as puppets. These leaders collected taxes, enforced laws, and met labor demands, all for British gain. It looked less invasive, but it was just as destructive. African rulers were now tools of their colonizers. Those who resisted were quickly replaced. Then there was Belgium, and its king, Leopold II. He didn't just colonize, he turned the Congo Free State into a private empire. 50 times the size of Belgium, it became a nightmare of forced labor and violence. But what was the purpose of colonization? The answer was wealth, resources, cheap labor, and profit. In West Africa, lush farmland was seized for plantations of cocoa and cotton. Traditional farmers were pushed aside, forced to grow cash crops that would fuel European industries. But nowhere was the brutality worse than the Congo. King Leopold II's obsession with rubber turned the region into a living hell. African villages were given impossible quotas. Those who failed faced mutilation, hands cut off as punishment. Entire communities were wiped out. Over 10 million Congolese are believed to have died under Leopold's reign, a genocide hidden behind the mask of economic progress. Meanwhile, in southern Africa, the British extracted diamonds and gold from the land. African miners worked in horrific conditions, underground, in suffocating heat, for little pay, while fortunes flowed to London. The land was taken. The people were broken. And the wealth of Africa fueled the rise of European empires. Colonization wasn't just economic, it was cultural annihilation. Traditional leadership was dismantled. Kings and chiefs, once symbols of autonomy, now answered to European governors. Those who resisted, burned villages, exile, or execution silenced them. African cultures were condemned. Missionaries arrived, declaring indigenous beliefs barbaric. Ceremonies, traditions, and religions that had defined African societies for centuries were banned or mocked. In their place came European education, teaching colonial history, European languages, and Western values, leaving generations disconnected from their heritage. But colonization had unintended consequences. Cities like Lagos, Nairobi, and Kinshasa grew into centers of change. Western education, brought to subjugate, planted seeds of resistance. A new African elite, teachers, journalists, and lawyers, emerged. These were the thinkers who would one day demand independence. Colonization tore Africa apart, but it also lit a spark. A new struggle was beginning to take shape. And, amidst the devastation, Africa's spirit refused to die. Resistance boiled beneath the surface. From the ashes of colonization, leaders would rise. Revolutions would begin. And the borders that divided Africa would someday be challenged by the people who never stopped calling it home. In the heart of West Africa, during the late 19th century, the French, armed with cannons and modern rifles, swept across the region like a machine, annexing land and crushing resistance. But then they met Samori Touré, a man they thought would fall like the rest. They were wrong. Samori was no king. He was a merchant-turned-leader, a strategist who built the Wassoulou Empire through alliances, trade, and unmatched tactical brilliance. When the French came, he didn't wait. He organized his forces into disciplined, mobile units, turning his army into a ghost that could strike and vanish in an instant. When the French arrived, they underestimated him, but his men used guerrilla tactics, ambushes, retreats, and lightning-fast attacks that frustrated French soldiers. Samori had another advantage: supply lines. He secured firearms from coastal traders, arming his fighters and turning them into one of Africa's most formidable forces. But in 1898, Samori was captured. They exiled him to Gabon, where he died, but his resistance sent a clear message: Africa would not fall quietly. He fought not for survival alone but for the dignity of his people, defying an empire that believed it could conquer without consequence. And decades earlier, in the rolling hills of southern Africa, another leader had reshaped history through blood and iron: Shaka Zulu. At the start of the 19th century, the Zulu were a small clan surrounded by larger, more powerful tribes. Then came Shaka, a leader who rejected tradition, transformed the Zulu warriors, and Shaka's reforms were brutal and revolutionary. He replaced the long throwing spear with the ikawa, a short stabbing weapon that turned every warrior into a lethal force in close combat. He introduced the bullhorn formation: the chest engaged the enemy head-on, the horns encircled them, and the loins held in reserve, ensuring a second wave of attack. Under Shaka's rule, the Zulu kingdom grew exponentially. Tribes were conquered or absorbed, creating a vast territory in what is now modern-day South Africa. But Shaka's methods were not without consequence. His wars, known as the Mfikane, or the Crushing, displaced thousands across southern Africa, creating ripples that would be felt for generations. Yet, his military genius and unrelenting drive turned the Zulu kingdom into a symbol of African power. Shaka Zulu proved that Africa could stand on its own, fiercely independent and unbroken by external forces. His legacy outlived him, inspiring resistance in the face of future colonial advances. In 1830, the French invaded Algeria, confident it would be an easy conquest. But in the deserts and mountains of North Africa, a leader emerged: Amir Abdelkader, a scholar who became a warrior. Abdelkader was unlike any enemy the French had faced. He united warring tribes under a single cause: resistance. He turned Algeria's harsh terrain into his greatest weapon. His forces struck French garrisons, retreated into the mountains, and reappeared stronger, fighting a war of mobility and precision. The French response was brutal. They burned villages, massacred civilians, and destroyed crops. It was scorched earth, designed to break Abdelkader's will. But he fought on, transforming the struggle into something greater: a fight for faith, identity, and survival. After years of relentless war, Abdelkader surrendered in 1847, but his fight wasn't over. His resistance became legend, inspiring generations of Algerians who would continue the struggle for independence, one that would only be won in 1962, over a century later. In West Africa, griots, oral historians, kept centuries of stories alive through music and spoken word. In Ethiopia, the Orthodox Church protected ancient manuscripts, preserving a heritage untouched by colonial influence. Artists in the Congo carved intricate masks and statues, blending resistance with spirituality. And across the continent, music and dance became weapons of defiance, expressions of freedom that no European law could silence. Every story told, every song sung, and every tradition passed down was an act of rebellion. Even in the darkest days of colonization, Africa's culture refused to die. By the early 20th century, Africa's resistance was no longer confined to battlefields. Colonial powers, in their arrogance, introduced Western education to control the continent. But it backfired. A new generation of Africans, teachers, journalists, lawyers, began to question colonial rule. In classrooms and newspapers, ideas of freedom, equality, and nationalism took root. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and Nnamdi Azikiwe in Nigeria emerged, planting the seeds of independence. The struggles of Samori Touré, Shaka Zulu, and Amir Abdelkader had not been in vain. Their sacrifices, their leadership, and their defiance inspired the movements that would one day tear down colonial empires. Africa had endured. and the fight for its future was only just beginning. The seeds were planted. Independence was coming. By the time World War II ended, Europe was in pieces. Its cities lay in ruins, economies shattered, and its empires, once seen as unstoppable, were crumbling under their own weight. Soldiers sent from Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean to fight in Europe came back with new ideas. They had seen nations fighting for freedom, and they asked themselves a simple question, if Europe could be liberated, why not us? But colonial powers weren't ready to let go. The British, French, Portuguese, and Belgians were desperate to hold on to their colonies, their last sources of wealth and power. The problem? Africa's people had already decided. Independence wasn't a question anymore, it was a demand. And there was no turning back. Amid this shifting world, a powerful voice rose, a call for unity that could shatter the colonial chains forever. Pan-Africanism, the belief that Africa's strength lay in its unity, became a rallying cry for leaders and freedom fighters. At its forefront was Kwame Nkrumah of the Gold Coast, a man whose speeches electrified crowds and whose vision transcended borders. He declared, "The independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the African continent." From Accra to Lagos, Nairobi to Algiers, Pan-African ideals took root. Leaders began to dream of a continent united, where colonialism would be replaced by African pride and self-governance. But dreams were not enough, freedom would come at a price. On March 6, 1957, the world watched as Ghana, formerly the Gold Coast, became the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence. Under Nkrumah's leadership, Ghana's fight had been strategic and diplomatic. Rather than turning to violence, Nkrumah built a political movement that united the people. Protests, strikes, and relentless political pressure forced the British to concede. When the Union Jack was lowered, replaced by Ghana's Black Star flag, it was more than a victory for one nation. Across Africa, people saw that freedom was possible. Nkrumah's success sent shockwaves through colonial governments. If one country could achieve independence, so could the rest. Ghana had lit the torch, but for other nations, the road would be far bloodier. While Ghana celebrated peace, in Algeria, the road to independence was soaked in blood. Algeria had been a French colony since 1830, but to France, it was more than a colony, it was part of their nation, and they refused to let it go. In 1954, the National Liberation Front, FLN, launched a brutal war for independence. Guerrilla fighters took to the mountains and cities, ambushing French forces in a war of attrition. The French responded with overwhelming force, mass arrests, torture, and massacres of entire villages. The city of Algiers became a war zone, with bombings and assassinations carried out on both sides. Over 1.5 million Algerians died in the 8-year conflict. For the French, Algeria represented the last vestige of their empire. For the Algerians, it was a fight for existence. In 1962, Algeria won its freedom, but the war left deep scars that still linger today. The scars of the war would shape the nation for generations. Algeria had proven that freedom wasn't given, it was taken. In East Africa, the British faced a different kind of resistance. The Mau Mau Uprising, 1952–1960, was a revolt rooted in desperation and injustice. For decades, the British had stolen fertile lands from the Kikuyu people, leaving them impoverished in their own country. The Mau Mau, a secretive and guerrilla movement, struck back. Fighters hid in the forests of Kenya, launching attacks on British settlers and colonial authorities. The British reacted with unmatched brutality, detaining over 1 million Kikuyu in camps where torture, forced labor, and starvation were common. Entire villages were razed, families destroyed, but the Mau Mau refused to surrender. By 1963, Kenya won its independence. The Mau Mau uprising had shaken the empire, showing that African resistance was no longer isolated. The fight for freedom was now unstoppable. So, from Ghana's peaceful triumph to Algeria's bloody war and Kenya's desperate uprising, the tide was turning. Colonial empires were collapsing, and Africa's nations were rising. But independence came with challenges. Colonial borders, drawn without regard for cultures or tribes, left nations fractured. Economies built to serve European powers were now ill-suited for African needs. Leaders faced political instability, corruption, and the looming shadow of neocolonialism, economic and political control still exerted by former colonial powers. Yet, despite these struggles, Africa stood tall. The sacrifices of leaders, freedom fighters, and ordinary people had rewritten history. The chains of colonialism were broken, and a new chapter had begun, one written by Africa itself. The fight for independence was over, but the fight to build a new Africa had just begun. So, where does Africa go from here? This is the question that echoes across a continent filled with potential and urgency. Africa holds 30% of the world's mineral resources, yet its people still face poverty and underdevelopment. It is the youngest continent, over 60% of its population is under 25, yet many of its youth struggle with unemployment and migration. What happens next depends on how Africa uses its history as a guide. The lessons of resistance, resilience, and unity can shape a new era, one where Africa's voice is heard not as an afterthought but as a leader in global progress. Will Africa be seen as a place to exploit, or as a partner in building a better future? The answer to that question will shape not just Africa's destiny, but the entire world. Subscribe and like this video, we're just getting started.